Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we sit down with a remarkable guest to unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. He didn't set out to be a journalist, but the Arab Spring pulled him into a career spent chasing the truth across wars, systems, and stories that don't always want to be told. In this conversation, Murtaza Hussain names what he sees as a real decline in American culture, intellectually, politically, and spiritually, and wrestles with how we got here. And by the end, it turns into something more personal, what it takes to hold on to meaning, faith, and clarity in a world that feels increasingly disorienting.
Hey everyone, I'm Haroon Mogul. Welcome to Avenue M. I'm joined by my partner in crime, Joey Taylor, and today we've got an incredible conversation with Murtaza Hussain, who is an investigative reporter for Dropsite News. And one of my favorite things about Murtaza's work, his corpus of work, is that he combines in a very unique way, in a very unusual way, really great in-depth reporting with really big picture thinking. He's willing to think outside of the box. And so for today's conversation, we're going to talk to him about what's happening in the US, in the Middle East, and his own relationship to engagement with religion and how that speaks to his life and his work. So with that, Murtaza, first of all, welcome to Avenue M.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
It's awesome to see you. I'm going to ask you the question that first occurred to me when we met. When we first met many years back, when you looked the same and I had hair, you told me that you did not actually set out to become an investigative reporter, that the career you are in now, the work you're doing now, was not the path you set out on when you first went out into the world. How and why did you decide to do what it is you do now?
Yeah, that was so many years ago. But I think I started writing around 2011, and that was during the period of the Arab Spring, which feels so long ago now. But my educational background and so forth is actually in economics and finance, and I'd studied that. Um, and that was kind of what I went into. And that was just kind of for pragmatic reasons, because if you like an immigrant or something, your parents are like, encouraging you to go into a field that makes no money and things like that. You have to be somewhat judicious in what you're doing. Yeah, I worked in finance, but I was very obviously moved and concerned with the events of the world, especially after 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. So I try to keep abreast of those things. But in 2011, when the Arab Spring started, I just kind of took of my own volition to go to Egypt and Tunisia and just see what's going on and just kind of go there, because I felt like it was a huge turning point in history potentially, and I didn't want to be left out of seeing some small part of that. So when I went to Egypt, and it was really quite inspiring. I saw the protests and the uprising and the crackdown and all these things, and I went a few times. And then during that time, I started blogging about it and posting on social media and so forth. And in 2011, it was still to some degree the infancy of social media and the internet as it was evolving. So at that time, there was really hunger for that type of, just you could say vox pop, or just ad hoc reporting and so forth from people around the world. And the Arab Spring was obviously a major global news event. That kind of started the ball rolling slowly, and people asking me to freelance for different publications like Al Jazeera or The Guardian and so forth, on.com, some other websites which are defunct now, which were popular at the time. And I was doing that while continuing to kind of have a day job working in finance and so forth. And then I would just kind of moonlight as a journalist. I think by 2013, 2 years after that point, I developed a pretty large network of people in the journalism world who I knew from freelancing. Some of them worked for Salon.com at the time. One of them was Glenn Greenwald. At the time, he was I got to know him pretty well, and he was also in 2013 reporting on the Edward Snowden documents, which was also a huge story at that time. So he actually asked me at that time to work on the Snowden documents, and because he was starting a new company the details of which were not totally clear at the time, but basically it would grow into an organization called The Intercept. And he asked me to join that along with a bunch of other younger journalists and more experienced journalists. And we launched The Intercept in 2013, at which point I transitioned to full-time working as a journalist. And then learning how to do investigative journalism and data journalism and all the things that we did in the Snowden documents and other things. And then since then, I've been doing that, so it's been 13 years now. And last year in 2024, we actually, myself and a few colleagues, left The Intercept and started a new publication called Dropsite News. And that's kind of intended to keep on the investigative mission of The Intercept, even in an even more focused and intense manner.
So you're originally Canadian, right? And so
Mhm.
you've been in the US for a long time. Do you think that part of the reason you're able to look at what our country does and our place in the world and even what's happening in the world has something to do with the fact that you are able to see things from multiple perspectives in ways that many Americans don't? Because I remember one of the things that always struck me when I first saw your work and first started reading your work wasn't just that you were covering stories no one else was covering, which, by the way, is obviously really important, is that you would then pull back and talk about trends and even make predictions in ways that I don't think many other journalists could do. And actually, I think many journalists don't even, aren't even able to connect those things, right? Like the events, the little things or quote unquote little things that are happening and the ways in which our world is fundamentally being transformed. Where does that come from?
Yeah, maybe growing up in a different country could have some influence on that. But I think it's probably multiple things. For instance, if America is a very Protestant, country in a way, so there's a default way of viewing things. And even like Catholics tend to often have a different view on America, or Jews, or so forth, just by virtue of being outside of that historical mainstream. So I guess being, a different religious background could be some of it. Obviously, not growing up in America, some of it having immigrant background from another part of the world also probably also contributes to that. Maybe just a personal inclination to prefer looking at things in the big picture. But yeah, I think that all kind of contributes. And in Canada, it's interesting. There's a very strong anti-American streak in mainstream Canadian culture because they don't really have a strong identity. So the identity is kind of being the fact that you're not American and just kind of doing whatever America doesn't do. And then, that's kind of not really a full basis to have national identity, but that's a really strong thing there. And not saying that people don't like Americans. It's just that that's kind of the national identity is just very inverse to that. And even now with all the annexation stuff with Trump, it really did trigger people in Canada quite a bit. And you just notice that when you're there. So I think that maybe that the Canadian aspect is interesting because Canada is a very interesting national identity. It's still in transformation, but it is very much based on this subtle rivalry with the United States, which you see from Canadians of all backgrounds.
Joe, you got a question or should I jump in?
I mean, yeah, I think we should ask the big question. So, from your perspective, I think it would be helpful to get a little bit of uh diagnosis for what ails America right now in this moment. So, obviously, you've been doing a lot of reporting for a long time. You bring this Canadian perspective, you bring this Muslim perspective as well. Um, what are some of the kind of the chief symptoms and diagnoses that you see at this moment in our country?
Yeah, I think that there's like a very marked intellectual decline. If you look at, especially American elite culture, if you look at how the way that U.S. politicians would speak a few decades ago, it's almost incomprehensible that a politician could speak like that today, because they would really appeal to the intellect of the population, and regardless if you agreed with them or not, these were clearly intelligent, thoughtful, rational people, and that was really, important expectation of elite culture in the United States. It seems that that's really degraded, and you see that, for instance, with the current political administration. It's a very marked decline intellectually in the manner of expression, the actual actions that they're taking at home and around the world. It's almost like the very powerful popular culture, entertainment culture that used to exist on a mass level in the United States. That's infected all aspects of American culture now. So we've kind of lost the idea of elitism in a positive manner in the U.S. that's something which I see. It's deeply problematic, especially when you think of the way that we kind of work on things is looking at things in international perspective. It's very strange that a country that's at the center of the global system, its leaders are notably an outlier in the intellectual decay that's taking place right now. I think that if you look at Russian leaders or Chinese leaders or any European leaders, whoever it is, Indian leaders, they don't speak in this way. They don't act in this kind of disturbing or irrational manner. And it's not just Trump; it's a whole it's a network of people around him and beyond that even as well. So I think that's a very troubling aspect. And then it's like this nihilism, this like nihilistic sort of attitude, which seems so prevalent, not just at the top, but even in the mainstream public and so forth as well too. It's hard to kind of make a generalization about America because it's not a monolith, but that definitely seems like something there. And the mass profusion of the impact of technology on people's lives, and gambling and pornography and all these things. It's like an opium war taking place against the American public through digital means. I think that's all happening right now, and it's under remarked upon. I think that the whatever media we have to discuss these things doesn't really have a firm handle on it or a way to talk about it. And the leaders of the country, such as they are also not engaged with it. So, all these undiagnosed phenomenon are taking place in front of us, which you can kind of tell. And it's actually something which, it's funny. I remember someone was talking about this a few years ago when the idea of dating apps came out. And dating apps were such a remarkable revolution in the manner in which people would, find mates or, get married or, whatever, date and things like that. That's really nothing like that's ever existed before. But it came about and totally revamped this very integral manner of human connection in a total different way out of the blue. And it's not even something that people have really thought about or talked about too much. It's like a total revolution in human affairs, which has gone about relatively unremarked because there's like 20 revolutions happening at the same time, mostly because of technology. And it's hard to even get a grasp on all of them. And so I think that all these things I've talked about, the kind of a major aspect is there's so much change happening at the moment, being driven by technology or other things, that it's even hard to diagnose all of it at present. So it's a very disorienting time for those reasons.
Damn.
Yeah, what an answer. Yeah.
That hurts to hear, but it's also true. I think that if you're under maybe 30 years old, you've never known a competent white president in the United States, which is
Well, the
wild.
funny thing is, we used to make fun of George W. Bush, said he was so inarticulate, and people made the
He wasn't
observation that
though. I mean,
he
at least
wasn't, he
now.
wasn't,
Now
he wasn't.
compared to now.
No, if you go back to look at him, he seems like a genius, and he seems very thoughtful and, moral and like grappling with deep questions and things like this. All the allegations against him at the time, they look ridiculous. Maybe compared to someone 20 years before him, that was true. But look at the decline 20 years later. We would be nostalgic for someone like that to be president. Not to excuse the bad things he did. It's just that him and people in his administration almost seem like they were, very responsible citizens or very stewards of the country at this point. So one can only imagine. And I do think that technology is playing a role in this because if you look at the way I mentioned the manner of expression of American politicians, and not just Republicans either, it seems very strongly to now mimic the manner of expression one would come across in social media. And many of these politicians are heavily on social media. They talk about it all the time. They're posting all the time. And they're speaking like social media flame wars and things like this. So the unreflective style of that you might see in some of these platforms that is now insinuated itself into the highest levels of elite communication, and it obviously has a huge impact on society as a whole. So I think that that's also a big part of it. And I can't imagine George W. Bush speaking the way Trump does. And that's not to say George W. Bush is good. It's just that there's clearly things have gotten a lot more degraded in that sense.
It's interesting to me that you started by talking about your own evolution as a reporter, beginning with the Arab Spring. And at that moment, Twitter was this potential, this force for good that was going to spark this populist kind of uprisings across the globe. And now it's something very, very different. And I just wonder, how do you determine your relationship with and engagement with these technological platforms that have the potential for good, but also have seemed to degrade our own capacity for discourse and thinking in such a profound way?
Well, if I did not work in this field, I'm not sure if I would use these platforms if I didn't have a professional compulsion to engage with them. I think I would probably deactivate my Twitter account and just not use it anymore and feel that's probably the better decision. I do use it because, although it's not ideal, all these, it's used heavily by global political figures and journalists and people to this day for very, very important things. Like, the president or the foreign ministers of countries will issue statements on Twitter or X or whatever in the midst of all the slop and psyops and, well, fake stuff and gambling and pornography, whatever that's else on there, they still use it for that purpose. So, it's really unfortunate that the platform itself has actually gotten a lot worse since the Arab Spring. It's much more manipulated, much more, you know, it's sort of like it's not a really healthy atmosphere for sharing information, but it's still used for that purpose. One feels compelled to engage with it if you're working in news, but it has a very negative social media in general. Well, actually, something else. When social media started, it was really a social platform. Like Facebook, for instance, when you first used it, it was to speak more to your friends and colleagues and family members and people you went to school with and things like that. That was the whole it was to deepen your social connections. Now, social media is not really about socializing anymore. It's more it has just become a different platform to receive messages from decentralized individuals or decentralized sources around the world. So, a lot of social media is like hearing from like the same 12 influencers again and again. And it's not like you are connecting with your neighbors on it anymore. Like it's alienating you from your neighbors more than ever and it's connecting you to someone far away. And I think that's a really negative, aspect. I would love a social media to be invented, which actually did connect you with people in your actual life, as opposed to further atomizing you and further, making people, isolated and lonely and all these things, which technology is doing. So, I can go on and on about the negative effects. I think, which I think outweigh the positives. Despite that, I do feel compelled to use it just for this purpose. But having said that, I think that the net effect of social media at this point, as it's developed at present, is probably very negative.
Yeah. I'm going to refrain from asking you about Lego music videos for a second and let Haroon ask you a question now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to hear you think out loud about something that I'm really struggling with. So, yeah, I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so I grew up where there's a certain baseline image of what America is, right? George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, fall of communism, hyperpower, that whole thing. And I feel like, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, but maybe, since Trump, I've been undergoing this kind of very intense, very severe process of questioning my own assumptions about human nature, about the country, about where the world is headed. And it's akin to a process of conceptual deconstruction that is very unsettling because I'm doing it to myself as the world appears to be falling apart. So you're very well read. For example, Ibn Khaldun's theory that 3 generations is all it takes for people in power to lose that power, right? I'm simplifying Ibn Khaldun dramatically. But for me, what's shocking is exactly what you're saying, is how fast things appear to have fallen apart and how low we appear to have come as a country, as a society. Like you said, that social media has become anti-social media. And I think one of the reasons that people like you and I and Joey are able to check our use of social media is because we remember a world where it didn't exist. We see it as a tool, not as an essential feature of life. But then the people you're talking about, these politicians, they grew up even before we did. And so I guess what I'm trying to get to is even to go back to Joey's question. How is it, and that image of an opium war is so resonant with me, how is it that America as a country has found itself in this predicament with so many self-inflicted wounds? We didn't have to do this to ourselves. No one forced this upon us. We basically, it feels like we stumbled into this ourselves, or we chose to fall into this trap for ourselves that we set for ourselves.
Well, I think that I do think technology and the rate of technological change is a big driver of this. Because if you notice, everything feels very weird. There's a weirdness at a social level, at a political level, and so forth. And that weirdness is actually a reflection of the fact that, when something is invented, let's say the printing press is invented or the horseshoe or something, It does change things for a while, but what happens usually is that human culture adapts new norms and practices to accommodate it and render what was weird and destabilizing before more familiar, more normal, taming the technology within acceptable human for human purposes and so forth. But what's happened now, the rate is so fast, we don't have time for the culture to adapt, to tame it. So by the time we get used to social media and start teaching our kids how to use it properly and so forth, chat GPT has been invented, or something, God knows what, Claude bot has been invented. So all those lessons go out the window anyways. And even if you're using, Twitter or Facebook, they don't stay stable. They change every year anyways. Whatever norm you made to deal with it 11 years ago. There actually were books written about Twitter like in 2013 teaching you, how the best way to use this in a healthy manner and so forth, which is completely irrelevant now because, technology has completely changed since then.
Also, who
So
reads
did,
books?
and who reads books, right?
Yeah.
So, all those things have, happened. So I think it's very hard to kind of get your, for how can this train ever stop? It's very difficult. But I also think that because of technology, history moves on fast forward now. So the rise and fall of Ibn Khaldun cycles could have taken generations before. But now, because things just move so fast, like, it could happen, America could collapse and fall and rebuild itself within one generation, but eventually. It's not even outside the realm of possibility anymore. Things just go a lot faster now. And I do think that looking at the current generation of American politicians, it's interesting because there's an intellectual decline I mentioned. But America is a very impressive edifice that's been built. The country itself, the global American empire, that's an incredible achievement just in a material standpoint. Clearly, it was the product of people who were very intelligent, very thoughtful, very capable, brave. All these positive human attributes had to be entailed in building something like that. We have something now which is kind of like when people in corporate world talk about this, the difference between founders and inheritors. Founders are, someone who had to have been very talented to make a company. But if it's inherited by their third generation of their descendants, they could be the biggest idiot and still run it. And maybe they'll preside over its destruction. But, they're in that role for different reasons. I think we have inheritor leaders right now. Donald Trump is an inheritor and so forth. He could never have built Washington, D.C. or built the American empire. He may not even be able to manage it for a short period of time. So that's kind of the issue. And how do you replace inheritors with a new generation of founders? It's a very difficult question, but I think that's kind of the problem. And also, finally, there's lack of humility because if you look at the current American governing class, they view themselves as very superior because of the fact that they're running this country and this empire, but they don't acknowledge the fact that they didn't build that. They don't acknowledge the humility that they should be what was built here and how important it is, how careful you have to be in managing it. They're very arrogant about that, and that's reflected in their own behavior, both at home and abroad. So that's also a big part of the problem. And maybe new generations of young people who do have more humility could maybe be better stewards of the system.
It was interesting to me that in your initial answer to what ails America, you talked about nihilism. A lot of what Haroon and I are doing with this podcast is we're talking about meaning making within the context of our own faiths, within the context of our communities, within the context of our roles as fathers, as husbands, as friends, that kind of thing. And I wonder if this shift from inheritor to founder is a part of what it could look like to make meaning in this moment in our history. I'm talking to somebody who is a founder of something, of Drop Site. And so, is there an invitation for us that's implicit within your description there of how to find meaning as a founder in this moment?
Well, it's interesting because one of the characteristics of this time when everything is in a very rapid flux. That's the nihilism is a product of that because all these, supposedly time honored values are being besmirched or rendered irrelevant. Like if you put a lot of faith in your life in the civic culture of the United States and Washington and so forth, it must be very disturbing that someone is in the White House is making such a mockery of it and so forth, and that is disturbing to a lot of people. And that's just one aspect, like the way that technology and social change of various types has destabilized traditional religion in many ways. It's also very unnerving to people. I think a very important thing is to look at beyond the maelstrom of all these events, what lasts and what's continued to persist despite that. So, family, a connection to God and so forth, all these things. None of those things have been impacted by all these other changes. Those things have all things you can still do, which are meaningful and which have been sources of meaning people for far before the country existed, or for millennia, for forever, basically. So trying to look for those things, the signal and the noise, that is something which I think is very important. And like all these things, like I was looking at the statistics, like more than half of people in the United States, or men in the United States now use these prediction market gambling apps and things like this, and or sports gambling, and then there's pornography and all these things. These are all like trying to make people very superficial. They're trying to remove the depth from human beings and just kind of turn them into like robots who respond to very superficial stimuli and so forth. So I think resisting that is very important. I think that's the major source of nihilism and so forth. They would like everyone to disappear. I don't know who is being done consciously, but it seems like the goal is to make people disappear into like a digital opium haze. So don't engage in the opium. They just try to stay out of it and find the meaning in things which are more lasting, which I mentioned earlier.
So I'm just gonna pause as an aside. I really liked what you did. You took Ibn Khaldun and you effectively, I don't know if you did this consciously, applied an end times hadith about the acceleration of time, and then you use that as a framework through which to reinterpret Ibn Khaldun, right? That as we move away from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, towards the end of time, time accelerates, right? So even narratives of generation
Mm.
and regeneration change. Uh, the reason that's interesting to me is you said that there are these things that last, that matter, right? But everything is being corroded. So moral formation, faith formation can't be exempted from that. I mean, I'll give you an example. We're talking about America, and now we'll talk about American Muslims. When I go to the masjid, I see something that I see in the Muslim majority world as well, which never ceases to strike me. So like you, I spent time in places like Egypt, and I remember one of my first impressions as an American Muslim when I went to these places is everyone's on a tasbih. That they'll be sitting around smoking hookah, playing backgammon, talking to their friends, and they've got a rosary at tasbih in their hand. They're in a state of dhikr. They're in a state of reflection, right? The name of God is pervasive in life. And now, anywhere I go, even in the masjid, I've got people just scroll on their phones. The minute prayer ends, they take their phone out. Like I think we're 4 or 5 years away from people just taking their phone out in the prayer itself, right? Like that corrosion is happening in faith spaces as well. It's happening in traditional spaces as well. So I'm wondering, you use this very strong word, resist. What does that look like? Like what's happening in faith spaces that you see? Maybe this is just, my personal impression, I'm wrong.
Well, I can't say I don't look at my phone a lot too, because I do, and I would like maybe I use the excuse this for work, and usually it is, but oftentimes it's just like a habit now at this point. So I can't say I don't do that. But you know, I think the important thing is, if you look at some of these 20th century theorists of technology, like Marshall McLuhan or Neil Postman and people like this, they were very concerned about uh, the power of these new information technologies and the fear that they were so powerful that they would overwhelm people's ability to, you know, th- their cognition or ability to rationally internalize things or reflect and so forth. They would kill the inner quiet and solitude that they felt was very important to be a human being. And they were talking like in the 60s and 80s and stuff. They were talking about television and radio. Would be shocked at the internet and how pervasive it is and how powerful it is in the smartphone. And I do think that there was a notable switch because we all grew up before the internet to some degree, but I think that the period of moving from a desktop computer then to like a BlackBerry type device, like a more tactile device, and then finally the iPhone. Those are very huge psychological shifts. And I think the black screen of the iPhone, the black mirror of the iPhone was a huge difference from the BlackBerry, which still rooted you in the world of buttons and stuff like that. So I think that there's a risk of people being psychologically overwhelmed by these things. And when you're psychologically overwhelmed, then you can't have the inner solitude you need to do zikr or to do remain in a state of reflection on God and so forth. So I think that the issue is that you know, when I say resist, it's like there's not really anybody talking about this per se because everyone is so overwhelmed with it, and there's like a American inclination to view technology positively and use like Luddite as an insult and so forth, even though Luddites actually weren't that bad and they kind of had a point. So I think that basically, when you do zikr, you're doing a form of resistance, actually. You're trying to cultivate your inner solitude and so forth. Or you're praying, he's a Christian or a Jew, whatever else it is. That's a form of resistance itself. So I think that the one thing that can never change is that finding the inner source of inspiration and the wellspring of God or spirituality, what you call it, in your heart. That's a form of resistance. It's a very important form of resistance, and that can never be taken away. And sometimes I think about this, like technology continues to advance. It's very confusing. It confuses all the things you've read in all the holy books and so forth. And I think about the extreme of that, let's transhumanism and so forth. That's very much on the horizon. Gene editing and human beings editing their personality and character and their children, or becoming something other than human. How could you still be religious in that sense? The world would be so confusing, and nothing in the books would seem to correspond to reality. How does one maintain in that sense? But I think you still can, actually, because what's in the inside, when you go internally, that's still impervious to anything happens outside the world around you. So I think that maintaining knowledge of that and so forth is very, very important. There's actually a book of reflections by Ibn Arabi, who was a Muslim, like a Sufi, I don't know how this philosopher or visionary or whatever you want to call him, who lived in Spain in the Middle Ages. And he kind of said that there will come a point in human history where there'll be only one person left to maintain an inner connection to God. Everyone else would just have lost that connection entirely. And he speculated that person would be born in China. He didn't really explain why. I think the implication is that when you go internally, you're maintaining that connection. You're resisting all these external forces. So you don't want to be of the people who have lost the connection. You want to hold on as long as you can. And if we are in a time of history is accelerating towards the end, then you want to try to make sure you're one of the last people who maintains the connection. And, it's getting harder because of all these stimuli we talked about. But that's what I think resistance is, maintaining the inner resistance, which is always still possible.
We're speaking to you. You're in New York right now. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on the Mamdani phenomenon that you're living in the midst of right now. Is it a source of hope for you? Is it a source of interest, curiosity? How are you experiencing what's happening in the city that you reside in?
Well, it's interesting. I've lived there for quite a while now, and it's noticeable positive changes actually in a very small, subtle way. There was big snowstorms this winter, and, I kind of got used to the fact that my neighborhood would flood during the snowstorms or the sidewalks would become unusable, especially with a big storm. But this time, it was notable proficiency and professionalism and speed with which everything was cleared away. And it was also notable how they did it. They paid local people quite generous, like $50 an hour to shovel on their own. And people from poorer communities were taking advantage of that. They made quite a bit of money and shoveling the snow in groups of people. And then it got done really fast and the money was redistributed to people who needed it. It kind of accomplished all these goals at the same time. So I think that, that's just one of many things, small things that have changed in this time. And you kind of notice the impact of corruption, how corrupt the city probably was during all these years. We know it was during all these years. So having someone who's not corrupt is such a great different change in that sense. It's such a positive sort of modification from what we're used to. So I think that's a really important thing. And obviously, the fact that he's charismatic and he's young and he's like from a Muslim background, which is a very Muslim city, actually, New York. So and that generation of people feels kind of that they're making an impact and they're sort of being recognized. And people like him. He's very, very popular. He's an extremely popular mayor. He's popular with people who are skeptical about him beforehand because of his background or because he said he was a socialist or whatever like that. All those fears have proven to be pretty much unfounded. And he's done a good job and he's been very, I think he's been popular with people who may have not been suspicious of him maybe a few years ago. So I think it's a really, that does give me hope. When I think of all the bad things happening in the world, I do think of New York and things that are happening here and the job he's doing and how well it's going so far. That does, inspire something. And it could also fight away the cynicism that people have been feeling about politics around the country. And I hope, inspire more people like him to run for office. And I'll say one thing, that young Muslim kids, they love this guy. They view him as an ideal type, as someone that could be a role model. And I think it's a very constructive role model. It's a role model that one would want to model some of themselves after, because he's a good civic steward of the city and the country and so forth. And he's someone who cares about everyone in the United States, and he's modeling a new form of civic nationalism. I would love for people to model their character after someone like that, as opposed to someone who may be more, destructive, or not as positive in many ways. So I think that's also a positive cultural connotation of his election for young people, which I'm seeing.
Our sponsor is the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University here in Cincinnati, which is dedicated to deepening understanding across faiths and promoting systemic change. You can learn more about the Brueggemann Center and Xavier University in the show notes. Now, back to the conversation.
Yeah, when you brought up the Arab Spring, it occurred to me that we had this window for like a year or two at the peak of the Arab Spring when the narrative around Muslims, the Muslim world, the Middle East shifted dramatically from the post 9/11 environment to something inspirational, hopeful, meaningful, even joyful. And now we are in something that feels a little similar. Obviously, there's layers of complexity here that make this a little bit different. But against the backdrop of genocide in Gaza, the current war, with Iran, there is a shift in American culture, right? That to me is really different, right? Like you said, it's not just, I find this just walking around Cincinnati, when you're not walking around Cincinnati, but, talking to people in Cincinnati, that people I would never have expected are Mamdani fans. Like when he comes up, when they see him on the news, they're like, hey, that guy's pretty cool, or I think he's onto something. And so it feels like we have two different countries, that there is this massive, I would even say like a democratic deficit, that what power is doing and what DC is doing has very little, it seems, to do with what most Americans want or where they want to be.
Yeah, I'll say I made all these negative comments about social media earlier, but I think that one positive aspect of it is that it's broke down the gatekeeping aspect that was very important in mass media. And in the 2000s, before social media, there was a very controlled negative image of Muslims given to the American public. You're very familiar with it, just a completely barbaric and, evil and, something like the way that the German tribes were depicted by the Roman Empire right before the empire fell. That was kind of how Muslims were depicted. And it was very one-dimensionally negative. So what happened with social media was that obviously, people can have these conversations. Mamdani did his own social media platform. He didn't rely on the New York Post to control his image. People saw for themselves what he's like. And that happened on a mass scale with millions of people in the United States who were like Muslim Americans and so forth. They were able to portray a different image, which was, articulate or attractive or, funny or whatever else it is. And that really did had a very powerful corrosive effect on the previous negative image, which had been put in place by the mass media beforehand, and it allowed these shifts in opinion. And so, yeah, I think that now I feel that being Muslim in America is much more normalized than it was when we were younger, for instance. And that's a product of that in part. With Mamdani, it's interesting. Even Trump likes Mamdani. Trump likes Mamdani because he's just so charismatic. He's so, endearing in many ways. And that's a platform he built for himself. He built for himself using his own broadcasting and publishing. He didn't rely on a PR firm to create that, a fake image of that, or to promote that in some way. He wasn't selected. He kind of rose in spite of the existing establishment, just by virtue of his own character and charisma and so forth. And that's very powerful. So, yeah, I do think there's a shift. And yeah, there was, I remember the Arab Spring, there was like a brief positive image of Muslims in America. And then it went so like 180-degree negative because Arab Spring just went so bad, and it became it was a terrible thing in the end, like, the way it developed. But I do think that, ironically, like letting all these Muslims in during the war on terror, like the immigration, kind of like you got to know them as your neighbors then. So it's harder to demonize them in that sense. Easier to have a negative opinion when they're just far away and you can't hear from them. But, it injected a lot of nuance when your coworkers and your, fellow students and stuff are a different background. You can see that normal people don't have horns. And then finally, a lot of people are very talented. I think it's very funny, like during the Gaza protests, there was a lot of, complaining about Muslims protesting. Not all Muslims, but like, not all of them are Muslim, but like off the Muslim protesters at these schools, people complaining about them at Yale and Harvard, whatever. But like, imagine like all these people are smart enough to get in Yale and Harvard and stuff like that, or all these elite schools. Clearly, they're very successful, assimilated. Assimilated is the wrong word, but they're doing very well in the system if they're able to be admitted in huge numbers in these elite schools, anyways. So that's a very interesting sort of telling sort of byproduct, and I think that the American public's opinion of Muslim people will improve further in the years to come because you have this generation of these politicians coming and others, celebrities, sports players, and so forth. It'll further normalize. And then, despite all the bad things about America, I think that I would rather live in America than in Europe and so forth, or even in parts of Asia with its very rigid national identities that are hard to assimilate in. I'd by far rather live in America because there is this fluid sort of identity. And there have been waves of immigration from other parts of the world in the past, which were difficult in the beginning, but then ended up being very natural. And I do think that's playing out in the U.S. today, despite whatever challenges are taking place.
Haroon, can I invite you to share your perspective on the recent Substack post that you wrote about assimilation, and get Murtaza to respond to your perspective?
Yeah, because naturally I can just recall it from memory with my shattered attention span and just middle-aged intellect. No, so I think on this conversation there was this conversation that came up in the last few weeks around should American Muslims assimilate, and these conversations come back to the surface every so often whenever there's a wave of anti-Muslim animus. I think at the moment some of that animus has to do with distracting from the war on Iran that doesn't seem to be going the way that I don't know if they even thought about what it would look like, but here we are. And I think that to your point, one of the things that intrigues me about Mamdani is that he is the very thing that people on the right claim to be looking for, right? He's an ambitious, articulate man who has clearly not failed to launch. He has launched. He's married. He's a person of faith. He has ambition. He has nationalism, right? He has patriotism. He can hold his ground. I don't know if you heard, he had that conversation with Layla Fadel, I think, last week, where she asked him, do you still think Trump is a fascist? And he said, yes. And she said, do you say it to his face? And he said, yes. Right. Like there's a level of, I guess, inner resolve that I don't know that many of us, if actually in that conversation would say that. And I guess what I'm asking is, and maybe I should point to this here, is instead of the conversation about should American Muslims assimilate, do you think that maybe American Muslims and maybe more broadly people of faith should be doing something different right now? Like, what should people of faith be right now? What does this moment call us to be or become or point ourselves and others around us towards?
That's an interesting question. So, how can I put this? Like, I think you should assimilate, but you should assimilate. Well, let me put it this way, actually. A lot of mosques, when we were growing up, they were built in the countries that people immigrated to, and they would try to replicate the cultural styles of the countries of origin of the immigrants of those countries. So they would build like domes and minarets. And there's actually a mosque near where my family lives in Toronto. It looks like almost comical. It looks like a plastic replica of the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and like it just looks weird actually in like an urban Western environment. So I think that you should assimilate in the sense that there are certain cultural forms which are normative in America or Europe and so forth, aesthetically or you know things like that, which you definitely should assimilate to, and you can enrich. In fact, just like in Islam in the past, for instance, kind of enriched what was good in Indian culture, Persian culture, Arab culture, African culture. It helped bring that out more. You should try to bring out the good things that exist in American culture more already, and there are many good things. Using Islam as a vehicle to do that, and then in doing so, you'll make it more attractive to people who live here as well too, and you also add something to the broader society. At the same time, you should not. Imbibe fads. You should not like get overwhelmed by fads. And I think that a lot of things that, every 10 years in the United States, if you go look at the newspaper, or that's not newspaper, but like the news published, if you still find it on Google 10 years ago, it's almost like gibberish. Like all the things people are talking about so heatedly and with such intensity, they're just irrelevant. You can barely even remember what these things were or why they mattered at the time. But there are people during those times who are completely overwhelmed, and they make their identity about whatever's happening at the moment. They take very drastic steps sometimes and change their lives based on what seems to be normative at some given time. So that kind of assimilation to the culture of fads and so forth, is not good. That's something you should resist. You should try to, again, like reflect on what are the timeless aspects of your own tradition and what are the timeless aspects of American culture and American history, and how can those things be assimilated to or assimilated with one another. You don't want to, like, for instance, like if Islam just became completely synonymous with progressivism during the 2010s. Imagine how deformed it would have become. It would have become completely something unrecognizable and probably just disappeared. And maybe people would have praised it in that moment for being so, whatever, assimilated or progressive at the time. But the cost would have been completely hollowing out whatever meaning it had and so forth. So I think that people should, they should try to like assimilate American Islam to one another, but not assimilate, to whatever prevailing ideology may be going on at the time. Because America has lots of ideologies. America changes every few decades, superficially at least. And you want to kind of assimilate only the good aspects or the timeless aspects, not what's ephemeral.
Joey, did he answer your question?
Yeah, he did. Sure. Yeah, that was great, man. It was good.
Yeah.
I have another question for you. It's a little bit, making a left turn here. You've been reporting for decades now, right? I mean, a decade and a half or so. I just wonder if there's a story or a person that you have reported on in your career that's still sticking with you. Somebody that kind of like carries the beacon for why you do this work. Someone who you can't quite shake because of the impact they've left on you.
Yeah, for many years at The Intercept, we did these stories about post 9/11 terrorism prosecution cases in the United States. And at that time, there were a tremendous number of cases which could only be described as entrapment or people who were just innocent, literally, who were arrested and used as political scapegoats, in some cases sent to prison for life in extremely harsh circumstances. So there's a particular family, the Duca family. Their three sons, all three of them, three or four sons were arrested on this terrorism plot in New Jersey, and they were accused of planning to attack a military base in New Jersey. But the case was so spurious. It literally, like, at the trial, at the sentencing, the judge actually said that I don't really see a lot of evidence of this, but the jury is not bothered by it, so why am I? And sentenced them to life in prison in Supermax, ADX, like the worst conditions you can imagine in the United States. And they're still there. This was in 2008 or something. They were arrested, and it's been like, 2 decades of their lives now in the situation. I hesitate to use the word innocent in many cases, but these guys were actually innocent. Like, if you can go read our story, we did a documentary about them, which was submitted to Sundance and showed at Sundance. They were literally did not know about this alleged plot that an informant had kind of cooked up and attributed to them. They weren't even aware of it when they were arrested. That those people do think about me a lot. I think about them a lot. And I think about, American society, again, it's not a monolith. It's very complex and so forth, but it is capable of these very evil things that you attribute, to authoritarian regimes of history. Those are happening in the United States now, today, right now, innocent people going to dungeons for life, for political reasons. So I do think about the Duca family. I do think people should look into that case. You can look in our investigation still online, the Vortex 5, the real story of the Vortex 5. That's a very, very important thing I think about. It's difficult to think about because there's no positive moral resolution to it. But, that is something which is just haunting my mind to this day.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thanks for sharing that. We'll definitely link to that in the show notes. Just a little follow up here. I'm sure when you're exposing these kinds of stories, and those kinds of moments, when we see what the American public is capable of, you understand that you yourself are risking something. So how do you vie with your own personal safety or the risk that you're taking as a reporter? What does that look like? Do you draw on your faith? Talk it through a little bit with us, if you would.
Well, the thing is, during like the Gaza war, some of our colleagues in Gaza were actually killed at drop site. They were killed, targeted, specifically named, and then killed by the Israeli military. And before that, during the Syrian civil war, several people I worked with as freelancers were actually killed fighting during the war. These people were, didn't have Western passports. They weren't known by anybody, but they were really intelligent, moral, good people. So I think of the risks that I face, like there is some like legal risk and harassment and threats and stuff like that. That is real, but I can't really dwell on it because it's so far less than what these other people have faced and faced to the ultimate degree. and they're still facing. So, I always just say that no, I can't, like, whatever risk I'm taking. I'm not very brave, to be honest. I take calculated risks. If I go somewhere, I will try to avoid this conflict. I'll try to avoid going to the very front line because that's a really risky thing to do. So, but there are people who don't have a choice. They live in the front line and they're our colleagues and they have been killed. So that's really much more salient. And, Dropsite and, myself and so forth, we do get like, personal threats or legal threats very frequently. But that's definitely, if you're not willing to, even entertain that, then there's no point even doing it. So yeah, that's kind of the way I think about it. It's more a question of scale and an impact, and we're still very privileged at the end of the day.
So you wrote a few pieces on your Substack about Gaza and the consequence of Gaza and power and how Muslim communities, American Muslim communities, should respond to or think about what the present moment reveals. I'm wondering, that has now been layered over by the events of the last, I don't know, what are we in now? Like basically almost 2 months of this war, or the latest chapter in this war. You mentioned Syria, Ahmad Shara in Syria. A lot has happened in the last few years. So much has happened that I can't even get my head around it. What do you think we're missing when you look at American media, the American media landscape? And I don't mean like the really ridiculous partisan outlets, but even the serious outlets. Like, what are they not seeing about this present moment and where this might be going? Because Americans we are bad at that. We are bad at stepping back and saying, what is the big picture? So what is the big picture?
Well, I think that one very important unremarked development which is taking place right now and has taken place is the siloing of people's information environments, which is accelerated even more so than it was 10 years ago when people first started talking about this, such that a lot of people I met, they didn't even really know that the Iran war is taking place. Like people who are not, focused in this world, or they're dimly aware of it, or they had like very fragmentary, incorrect information about it. That's a very, profound sort of shift. Such as it's hard. Like there haven't really been anti-war protests for the most part about this huge war. Not really. There, it's been a little strange actually, because during the Iraq War when it started, there were these huge protests, and they didn't stop the war, but they at least showed that we're all cognitively on the same page and having the same conversation. So I think with the demise of that, it's been harder to engage in coordinated mass political action. Makes you really skeptical about democracy as well too. Does it still exist even more? If the president can launch a major war without engaging in a discussion about with the American public without trying to persuade people. To go back to George W. Bush, George W. Bush did try to persuade people. He spent a lot of time trying to persuade people. There was no persuasion here. They just kind of did it like an imperial act. And the public is kind of confused or AWOL or whatever. So I think that is a very, disturbing sort of development. And I think that that's going to accelerate now because now if you look at these technologists, they're talking about tailored AI content specific to the needs and wants and desires of every individual person. So if that happens, let's say like in 5 years, there is content like that and it's very powerful and like everyone's stepping into their own personal matrix, then we'll have even less to talk to each other about. And if we have even less shared space of, agreement or discussion of reality, then we're even more likely to be subjects of somebody else as opposed to citizens. So I think that's a really, strange and disturbing development. So I think that people who are in power, if nothing is done to check this, then they will be able to take more decisions. They can start wars wherever they want, as long as they keep most people out of it. No one will even care. That's kind of a development happening right now. So like the Iran war is just a shocking, like that's just crazy to me that happened and the way it happened, and what it suggests about the degradation of democracy in the United States. Because starting a war is basically the gravest thing an elected official could do, and they did it. And, there isn't really much of a check, it turns out, on their ability to do that. And the check is much less than it was some years prior. And Congress and all these things are supposed to be checks and balances. They're also really absent in this case. So I think it's a very disturbing sort of commentary. And how does one reverse institutional decay like that? I really don't know. And if you look at the political science literature, like Francis Fukuyama had a two-volume study on the origins and decay of political institutions. I actually asked him about this once at an event. I was like, I read your books. Like you mentioned how the things decay, get corrupted, how do you fix them? And he's like, you don't really like. There's not really an answer to that. So I think the one thing you can do is you could build new institutions, which maybe do fill the role. But once institutions are corrupted and destroyed, it really is hard to the existing ones. It's hard to revivify them, or there's not really a clear path to do so.
So can I push back a little bit on that and just ask you a question then? I agree that there's not a lot of protest. Maybe that's also because at this point people have given up hope on reasoning with an administration that seems, as you pointed out, impervious to reason or uninterested in any kind of foresight. So maybe people are just the only way out of this nightmare scenario are the midterms, right? But isn't reality a check? I mean, he can go to war and he can tell us how it's going, but I see how much gas costs. I'm watching prices rise. If I live in Asia, I've got a 4-day, 3-day work week, right? There's not a lot of ways to spin something that affects you tangibly and personally. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe we do get siloed.
Well, I think a big part of it, first of all, is the nature of the American military, which is a volunteer military. And, they do try to insulate the majority of the public as much as possible from the direct consequences of the war in the short term. And like the Vietnam War, for instance, relied on the draft and that completely radicalized American society as a result and forced people to pay attention to the war because of the fact that they were very directly impacted by it. Right now, there's increase in gas prices. There's going to be increase in fuel prices and airplane fuel and food prices and many, many other things, technology prices, inflation is going to get really bad, actually, the longer this goes on. And I was in Asia, I was in Singapore and Malaysia last week, and you really feel it now already there. People are talking about it. There's rationing, there's like huge increases in the prices of everything. Like it's really undeniable. I think we haven't hit that stage yet in the United States. And ironically, despite the fact America started the war, it may be the country that has the most capacity to insulate itself by virtue of its tremendous resources, but also the fact it's going to externalize the costs to the rest of the world as much as possible. And maybe that will result in the decay of the American empire, but we could at least save off some of the impacts at home, enough for the midterms, maybe. If they really pull all the strings. So I think that's it. And I think people they're not really aware of the necessarily yet of the direct correlation between the war and gas prices yet. And they're being told by the president that they're going to come down immediately. This is a transient situation. Trump has declared victory pretty much since the first 48 hours of the war to kind of calm markets and say this is all over. He's doing that even now. He's trying to suggest it's over. Really, we could talk more about that, but there's really a mismatch in the perception situation between the Americans and the Iranians right now. The Iranians are really in for this for the long haul, potentially, whereas Trump just wants to wrap it up to get prices back down. So, I think that's all kind of contributing situation where people don't know what to make of things. And, I can't even say that the information is not out there. It is out there. It's just that are people reading it? Are they looking at something else? Are they in a different information bubble? Are they just gambling? It's hard to really say exactly, but I think that what's going to happen is that as inflation continues to rise, people will be generally upset. And whether that general dissatisfaction and discontentness translate to the backlash against the war, it may or may not. They may redirect the sentiments elsewhere. They may not make a connection. They may, do something else with it. I don't know, but it's. I think they're counting on the American public. First of all, they're counting on the situation ending soon, and they're counting on the American public being distractible enough that they could evade this. But I do think that all that said, I think probably this war is going to be result in significant electoral changes in November for the midterms, because I don't think inflation is going to be down by that time. It's going to be higher than ever around that time.
The question that I had for you, there's this like kind of famous Rilke poem about living the question. And so I had this big, huge question for you. Is there a question right now that you're living that you don't have a satisfying answer for?
Oh, that's a good one question. I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, just like finding meaning and what actually matters in a kind of situation where the traditional sources of meaning maybe are in flux or under siege and so forth. So kind of maintaining that, trying to stay grounded spiritually, seeing what will last 100 years from now as opposed to, what it probably will be irrelevant 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and not getting too wrapped up in the latter. So I think that's the constant battle people have to be engaged in. And, I myself engage in as much as anybody else. So I think that's kind of the way I think about that.
So I want to ask one final question. We've talked a lot about religion, the importance of eternal values, what lasts. I want to ask a question within religion. So, you and I both were born into Muslim families, but I'm sure there's a moment for all of us when we have to choose whether or not we want to commit to or continue on that path. And along the way, there are these insights or transformations that ground us within the tradition, maybe change how we see the tradition. What for you was the moment that kept you in the faith you were born into?
When I was 19, I remember I was really thinking about this. And, I kind of like when you are an ordinary person living in like a very secular society, it kind of seems like religion is obviously false because, it has all these, that's like the implication because it's supernatural or it just seems like a bunch of fairy tales from the past and so forth, or it's not historical. Science or whatever you want to call it. It seems that it's obviously a misnomer, but whatever, like this seems has more gravitas or it's more empirically verifiable and things like that. And that's what matters. So, there's a lot of pressure, like almost seems like a default you should become, atheist or materialist or whatever. So I remember I thought about this. I was like, when I was 19, I was like, maybe it's true. Maybe I should just kind of like, step what seems obvious and just kind of, be done with that. But I actually decided to embark on a course of study before making a decision about that. And I remember I read several books, and I read one particular book called Major Themes of the Quran by a guy named Fazl Rahman, who was like a, philosopher in the 20th century, and he moved to the United States, actually, and Chicago, and he wrote this book. And that book was such interesting because it actually reconciled an intellectual, modern intellectual sort of thought and, positivism or whatever with religion and with the Quran itself, actually. And kind of, he put it on an intellectually satisfying format for me. And, normally when you go to like a mosque or something, I don't know if it's the case today, maybe less so than before, but it wasn't very intellectually stimulating most of the time. It was kind of like you would like politely just nod your head and like whatever and just forget about what you left. I think it's changed a little bit now, but that was certainly the case when I was growing up. But then I saw for the first time this very intellectual, sort of like very deeply intelligent person explaining this in a context I was not familiar with. And that led me to more sort of this, something which is satisfying to me, a way explanation of all these things. And then my view became totally different. I think it would be crazy to be an atheist, actually. It would be very irrational, actually, in my opinion, based on the way I understand things now. So it really did an inversion of the way I thought about things. So that was kind of the moment. Those books and that course of study, and that book specifically by Fazl Rahman, were really a turning point when I was young, where I could have gone either way in that sense.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to have you. We've been reading your work and appreciating your work for quite some time, so it means a lot for you to say yes to be with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, man.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Really fun conversation.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.